So good afternoon and welcome to the annual Morley Gunderson Lecture in Labor Economics. We're very pleased that so many of you could join us this afternoon for our first ever hybrid version of this lecture. My name is Carol Chin, and I have the privilege of serving as the principal of Wordsworth College. I would like to begin by acknowledging the sacred land upon which the University of Toronto operates. It has been a site of human activity for more than 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and to share knowledge in this community and on this territory. The Morley Gunderson Lecture is jointly sponsored by Wordsworth College, the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources, and the Department of Economics. Wordsworth College has had a long-standing relationship with the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources. In the mid-1970s, Wordsworth established a certificate in personnel and industrial relations, and in 1986, an undergraduate degree program in labor management relations, which was later renamed employment relations. Throughout this time, a close relationship was established with the center, as many of the courses in both the undergraduate program and the certificate program in human resources management were taught by center faculty. The college also has long-standing ties with economics. From 1991 to 1998, the principal of Wordsworth College was Noah Meltz, a former director of the center and also a professor of labor economics. Given the interconnectedness between these three units, Wordsworth, the Center, and the Department of Economics decided in 2015 to establish an annual lecture on labor economics and industrial relations and human resources. It was named for Professor Morley Gunderson to honor his contributions to Canadian labor economics and industrial relations over the past 5 decades, And it includes an annual prize for a current student or graduate of the center. And we're very pleased that Morley is with us this afternoon too. Morley. I would now like to introduce Professor Frank Reed, Associate Director, Graduate Program at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources. He's standing in for Professor Rafael Lopez, Director of the Center, who could not be with us this afternoon. Professor Reed will explain today's proceedings and then introduce the winner of the Morley Gunderson Prize for 2021. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carol. So first of all, I'd like to just take the opportunity to thank some of the people involved in organizing this event and promoting it. So Joanna Jiang and Monda Verkin at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources. And then also our friends from Wordsworth College, Stephanie Woodside and Barbara Track. So maybe we can just give those. Just a quick rundown of kind of where we're going, the brief kind of itinerary. So what we'll be doing immediately is I'll be presenting the Morley Gunderson Prize to the recipient of that award. And then we will shift over. I'll be handing it over to Dwayne Benjamin, the former chair of the Department of Economics, and who's now moved down to the president's office and advisor to the people at Simcoe Hall. And then we'll have the talk. So after the talk, there'll be about 45 minutes where people can ask questions, and it'll be we'll take questions both from people who are here in person and also people who are watching online. So I'm really delighted to present the winner of the Morley Gunderson Prize this year, especially because this prize was introduced about 25 years ago, when I was just starting off a term as director of the center, and Morley had just finished 2 terms. And he had done an outstanding job, as director of the center. He established a PhD program during his term as director, and also managed to keep all of his friends, as far as I know, which is an accomplishment for someone who is in an administrative position. Morley is still intimately involved at the center. He teaches the PhD seminar at the center, and he's also maintaining a very active publishing career, and he's sort of still publishing extensively. Morley has had a long term at the University of Toronto. Carol mentioned 5 years and then changed it to 5 decades. And that's right. Morley came to the center to the University of Toronto in 1971, which means this year he celebrated 50 years at the University of Toronto. So. In addition to all his work with the PhD students, Morley has done a lot for undergraduate students and master's students, especially by being one of the co-authors of the leading labor economics textbook. Morley wrote the first edition, and along the way to the 9th edition, he's picked up a few co-authors, including our esteemed speaker tonight, Lemieux, and also my colleague, Dwayne Benjamin. So just as a reminder, so the Morley Gunderson Prize recognizes a graduate of the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources who has had some outstanding career accomplishments and also has continued to maintain contact with the center and kind of given back to the center over time. So nominations for the award are solicited. They go to the director of the center, and then a winner is determined. So the winner this year is Ting Ting Zong. And I don't know if she was up on the screen a little while ago. She's, I guess she'll be saying a few words shortly. She's currently an assistant professor at the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois. She's got research interests in both kind of in employment relations and kind of labor economics. One of the things she has focused on is social media communication in the labor movements. She's also looked at occupational regulation, and particularly the emergence of non-degree credentials. At the university, we sort of look at those a little bit askance, but they're very important. And particularly, she's found that they're important for marginalized groups such as women and immigrants. So let me now invite Ting Ting to say a few words. Ting Ting.
Hi, thanks, Professor Ray. And I don't know, like I'm first, thank you for organizers giving me this opportunity to participate virtually. And our semester hasn't finished, so I wasn't able to kind of like, join the event on ground, but I do wish that I had the opportunity, especially like sitting next to Morley and give him a friendly nudge if I need. But I just want to kind of like speak briefly, saying that I'm extremely honored for getting this award. And I learned a great deal of professional knowledge and even how to become a better person as a center. And the amazing expertise and kindness and the genuine caring that housed in that little magic house that forever shapes who I am. So I'm really grateful for this award from my alma mater, and also get this opportunity to thank you, all the professors, all the staffs, and my former office mate in the PhD program, and some of the master students I encountered at the center during my 5 years there. And in particular, I want to thank you, Professor Gunderson, for his guidance and mentorship. and also Professor Gomez for his always support and all the advice and continued collaboration with me. And I also want to thank other professors at the center. Professor Reid, I've been your teaching assistant for 2 years, and you gave me the opportunity to really engage and get a deeper understanding of the labor market and the public policy. Professor Dewey, and you helped me to really master a complex research project that relevant to labor policy. And so many professors, Professor Worma, Professor Krasinski, and Professor Dion Polar, and you all gave me so much. And I think, like I said, this is an amazing community, and I learned everything that helped me become who I am at the center during that 5 years I stayed at the center. So to me, center is a forever home, and I appreciate everything that I got from the center. Thank you so much. Thank you for this recognition, and thank you for the opportunity for giving me this time to really express my deepest gratitude. And I will continue to try my best and do my best at my work. Thanks so much.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Dwayne Benjamin. I currently have the privilege of serving as the Vice Provost for Strategic Enrollment Management, but in my heart really lies in my role as a Professor of Economics. And the Chair of the Department of Economics, Ettore Damiano, has asked me on his behalf to offer welcome to all of you in the room, but also virtually attending today's lecture. I also want to echo Frank's thanks to the organizers who have helped keep everything on track, especially given the complexity of offering and launching a hybrid event. So it's a real privilege for me to introduce Thomas Lemieux. Professor Thomas Lemieux is a professor of economics at the Vancouver School of Economics. He's actually the perfect speaker for the Gunderson lecture. And not just for today's topic, which is clearly pertains to, as you know, to unions and inequality, which is spans the interests of students and faculty at the CIR-HR, as well as the Department of Economics and Woodsworth College. But really, if you look at his entire body and corpus of research, it fits into this exact set of themes. But I want to let you know that it didn't start out this way. In fact, I was a graduate student, same cohort, exiting cohort as Thomas in the industrial relations section at Princeton. And in the computer room that we had, which was like a lab, there was a light bulb, a red light bulb with a warning sign. It said, "Warning, labor supply estimation in progress." And there had been an apparent malfunction that the bulb was not lit. Now, those of us with a decent amount of common sense knew that the mere existence of that light bulb should have been enough warning to all who entered to not go there. But Thomas, whether it was the siren call of the red light or whatever it was, or just happened to have a good data set, he decided to base his dissertation on estimating labor supply with a whack of unobservables using underground economy data from Quebec City and looking at the impact of taxes. Now, that paper was ultimately published in the AER. However, I think the experience of wandering around the wilderness of a likelihood function nonlinear estimation must have scarred him, because very soon after his dissertation, he turned to the much more mundane subject of inequality, which was utterly uncool at the time, let alone combining anything to do with unions and any other topic, because given the decline of unionization, it was really no longer a hot topic. So if you were to look at Thomas' CV and look at the as I said, the corpus of work, I mean, it is incredibly impressive, right? I counted the papers because I think that's one of the things you do. There's over 50 journal articles, most of them in the very top journals, as well as another 25 papers in book chapters, just an incredible amount of output. And if you look at the common themes in the work, there really is a significant amount of work on inequality, which we'll see today. Education and skills, if you think to understanding how we understand inequality of earnings, we know that skills and education are really critical explanations and supply and demand behind it. But what was really interesting about Thomas' work is really the focus on institutions. And it's not just looking at institutions in the abstract, but actually using real data, doing comparative research, using different countries' data to try to understand the impact of these institutions. One of Thomas' most influential papers was with John DiNardo and Nicole Fortin, where they developed a methodology for decomposing earnings distribution, earnings inequality and the distribution of earnings by different kinds of factors. And it's subsequently become known as a DFL decomposition. And you know you've really made it when you have not just one Stata Ado file out there, but competing Stata Ado files and R routines named after your work. Now, unless you think that Thomas sat in his office writing papers, which I think for most people would be a full-time job to get that degree of output, Thomas has served the profession in so many ways beyond that. So he served, for example, as the chair or director of the department, the Vancouver School of Economics, for several years. He's been president of the Canadian Economics Association, which is, if you know, it's actually not just an honor, it's actually a lot of work. He's currently the president-elect of the Society of Labor Economists, a very prestigious position that probably also comes with work. He was co-editor of the AER, founding co-editor of the AEJ. He also, in the service of all of our academic pursuits as labor economists, has worked closely as an advisor with Statistics Canada on helping them improve their data. So the list really goes on. And finally, as was alluded to by Frank, I just want to acknowledge, my own connection to Thomas and Morley through the textbook, and that we also have Craig Riddell and Tammy Schroll added to the list. So that's a real privilege on my part. So Thomas, I'm delighted to welcome you to the University of Toronto and look forward to hearing your talk.
Maybe before I start sharing my slides, I'd just like to say a couple of words. Well, thanks a lot for the kind words. I got worried when Dwayne started talking about our years as graduate students. He knows a lot of things about me, but yeah, the red light, that's totally okay. Well, congratulations, Ting Ting. I should say that Ting Ting was an undergraduate at UBC. It's another great example of the collaboration that we have in many ways between UBC and U of T. It's great to be in person. I realize many of you are online, but I've really been enjoying my visit. It's the first time in almost 2 years I'm wearing a tie. It's going back into the world as it used to be slowly, but we'll get there. And finally, I would just like to say that I'm truly honored to be the Gunderson speaker for this year. I mean, Morley is really a giant in our field, labor economics and industrial relations. Even though I'm not myself from an IR background, work in industrial relations, including work by Morley, has really has helped me understand lots of things about the research I was doing in labor. And Morley, I remember Dwayne was talking when we were graduate students, and back then, when I would start working on topics, often one of the first things I would do is like, okay, let's look at what Morley has written about this, because if you look at Morley's contribution, the work really covers, well, I would not say each and every aspect of labor economics, but certainly close to that. And that's still something I tend to do today. Morley has a magnetic personality. That's how he kept attracting all these co-authors to work on the book with him. And I should say that, yeah, like everything else, working on a textbook or other big projects, there's great things about it, sometimes not so great things about it when you have to do the real work. But I must say, this whole venture gave me the opportunity to know Morley better. So that's for sure, the best thing about having been involved in this book. All right, so on that note, let me now switch to the lecture. We're all good in terms of IT. Okay, perfect. Well, as you can see, this is actually a pretty broad kind of title, labor laws, unionization, and wage setting. And let me tell you right away what I'm going to mean by this, just to narrow things down a little bit. But part of the motivation for that particular lecture is that I think it both has an IR and labor economics, ingredients into it. And that's actually a good example where research in labor economics benefits a lot from other work that's been done in industrial relations. Okay, narrowing down, I would say the three elements of the title, the first two, talking about labor laws and unionization, that's slightly more the IR part. That's the way I would put it. And the point there is just that the legal and policy environment, what I broadly call the labor laws, is of course an important driver of unionization. There's lots of great work on that. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. My own research has been more about the second bullet here, which is more the union wage effects, the impact of unionization on wages, and in particular, as Dwayne was mentioning, how unionization can affect not only the level of wages, but also the wage distribution. So very broadly speaking, the twin goals of these lecture, in one sense, maybe that's going to sound overly ambitious, but it's trying to put these two things a little bit together, because those of us working in labor literature will tend to focus, okay, what do unions do, without thinking so much about, what actually is shaping the rate of unionization. And likewise, some of the IR literature will have lots of great things to say about the legal and policy environment, but not necessarily go all the way to what's the overall impact of that on wages and the wage distribution. So in one sense, what I'm going to try to do today is, okay, try to go these different steps, from the legal policy environment that affects unionization, and see at the end of the day how it may be shaping up wages, okay? And while doing that, the second goal is to try to understand a little bit better how this relationship works. And actually, based on some recent work I've been doing, I've come to believe that this relationship is not going to be purely kind of a linear one, say labor laws affect unionization that then affect wages, but all the labor law, the legal environment can also directly affect wages. I'll say more about that. If it didn't, I could do a very standard econ paper where I would say, okay, these labor laws, I can use that as instrumental variables for unionization, because as I'm going to tell you later on, it's been one of the fields in economics where we have not been so successful thinking of these great natural experiments, etc., to see what's really the causal impact of unions on wages. Okay, so roughly speaking, these are the issues I'm going to be talking about. And the last part of the presentation, I'm going to be trying to quantify these things by telling you about a recent paper I just completed with Nicole Fortin once again, and Neil Lloyd, who's one of our former students at UBC, who's now at the University of Warwick. Okay, in that case, it's actually going to be looking at some specific legal institution right to work laws, it's more of a US issue than a Canadian issue, but I think it's going to be speaking broadly about the issue I'm interested in. Okay, and then before I dwell into the details, why does it matter, all that stuff? I think Dwayne has already, as part of his introduction, mentioned some of that. And I would say, there's some really broad phenomena, growing inequality, but also this phenomena of the labor share going down. That's been true in Canada, it's been true in many other countries, essentially meaning that not only you have growing inequality within pool of workers, but workers as a share of total income, are getting a lower and lower share. Okay, and in one sense, the decline of the rate of unionization is definitely a factor that can account for at least part of these two phenomena. And in one sense, my big picture thinking about it is that, well, maybe by just focusing on unionization per se, I may be missing a little bit because, the legal environment that shapes unionization may also have some broader impact on things like the labor share and inequality. And you'll see that, one of the factor I'm going to be telling you about is this business of a union threat effect. And there's other mechanisms that could be important, but the idea in general is that when you make it harder for unions to represent workers, and that's what these right to work laws in the US do, not only are you going to perhaps reduce wages by reducing unionization, but by reducing the threat of unionization, it means that many other employers could say, okay, I'm going to pay my workers a little better so that I don't get a union, because most firms don't really like to get a union. But, that could give you another channel that would be important. And actually, just to show you how important this is, talking of another co-author that's of the book that Morley has attracted over time, the very first one, paper I did with Craig Riddell. And this is actually showing you the blue line on top is a labor share in Canada. You see it kind of goes up and down, but essentially the trend is very clear over time. When I was a graduate student, there was kind of this law that the labor shares 2/3, and you see it was about 2/3 in those days, but it's been going down steadily. And you also see inequality in this picture, because then if you say, okay, let's not look just at the labor share, but the share of the lower 99%, you just take off the top 1%, and then you see that the share of the total income going to workers goes down even more. All right, now just in terms of the plan for the presentation. So as I told you, I'm first going to talk about these two bits. First how labor laws can affect unionization, then how unionization affect wages. So that's actually just going to be a quick summary of the main ideas. There's not going to be new results there. Then I'm going to tell you a little more about this framework I just briefly alluded to for trying to think about how these three pieces fit together. And part of it is going to be like this threat effect of unionization. I'm going to think of that as, potentially like a direct impact of labor laws that affect wages directly, while the indirect effect would be the impact that's mediated through through unionization. And actually, if you thought that the only impact of labor laws was mediated through unionization, then you could use labor laws as an instrumental variable to get at the causal effect. But, I'm going to tell you about this, but in fairly general term. And as I said, the last part of the presentation, based on recent work, looking at the impact of right to work laws in the US, I'll say much more about that. But, these are laws that used to be, all the southern states had these right to work laws, very few of the northern states, and it was kind of hard to analyze empirically because there was not much change over time. But starting about 10 years ago, a bunch of big Midwestern states have started adopting right to work laws. So, it makes it possible to study this particular labor market institution, legal institution in a little more detail. And I'm going to have actually a second approach on how to look at these impacts, but let me wait a little bit until we get there. Okay, so the first topic, labor laws and unionization, and essentially, generally speaking, and I'm really totally oversimplifying here, but in Canada and the US, if you have a majority of workers in the workplace who want to be unionized, in principle, they can get unionized. But actually, what we've learned is that often small differences in the legal environment can have a big impact. Now it's really getting confusing. That's another Riddell now that we're talking about. So, but it's all very close to Morley and the IR Center here. So this one actually is a paper I love by Chris Riddell, because it's also about BC, where BC, as you may know, the politics there has always been kind of flipping back and forth between the NDP and then the various version of what we would call the Conservative Party. It used to be the social credit back what Chris was studying. And what he showed is actually, if you form a union by just getting people to sign up membership cards and you get enough and that's it, versus organizing elections, which is the US style way of getting a union. Once you have the election, it takes more time. Employers can do much more stuff. Management can get involved trying to convince workers to get unionized. So essentially lots of great work, in the Canadian context, lots of great work coming from people around Morley. And I guess what I took from that is that even when, if you say you have this basic principle that yes, workers, if a majority of workers want to be unionized, they can get unionized. It's not that simple, and actually institutional details can matter a lot. So that's a big motivation for what I'm going to do in this paper. And there's also work on right to work, famous paper by Elwood and Fine in the US showing that when you have these right to work legislation, unions are much less likely to win organizing election. And I should say that if you're interested in these issues, it's not only the legal context, but the policy context is important too. To what extent you allow outsourcing, for instance, in the public sector, can have actually a big impact both on wages and unionization. But that's not central to my presentation. What's a little more central is these right to work laws. So let me just tell you quickly what this business is about. So basically in Canada, as most of you probably know, graduate students all know that being TAs at the University of Toronto, when you're a member of a union, essentially the union dues can be automatically deducted by employers. Actually, if the union asks, the employer has to do it. That's the so-called RAND formula in Canada. Well, not so much in many places in the US. And essentially what happens is that despite the fact that once the old workforce in the bargaining group is covered by a collective bargaining agreement, and all members of the group get the same benefits in terms of wage, benefits, grievance procedure, what the right to work law says is that it's illegal to force workers to pay their union dues. So there's no automatic deductions by employers, etc. So what does it cause? Well, of course, it weakens unions because now you're allowing free riding. It's you're getting a service and no one is forced to pay for it. And if you know about the history of labor legislation in Canada and the US, there was a famous Wagner Act in the US, shortly followed by this Taft-Hartley Act that essentially said that it was legal for states to have these right to work laws. And it was adopted right away by lots of states, mostly southern states. And then it became pretty stagnant. From time to time, one state would adopt that. But then suddenly there was a whole bunch of states, and in particular, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana, states that you think traditionally as being more Democrat, more pro-union, that actually where Republican governors got in control and these right to work laws were adopted. So now you can actually do an event study kind of approach of that, which is what I'm going to show you later on. But, just to illustrate, your map, I think it's okay to put a map of the US. It's Thanksgiving Day, for our friends down the border. So in appreciation, here's map of the US, in a Canadian lecture, but you see the red states with the years there are showing you which states have actually adopted these right to work laws in recent year. And as I was telling you, there's Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, and then Kentucky and West Virginia a bit later on. But you see it's really scattered geographically. And this part in one sense is a bit surprising because Michigan, I've always thought, well, that's really a pro-union state, but I guess no longer. Okay, so that's the background. Now talking about union wage effects. So there's a huge literature on that. Even back when Dwayne and I were graduate students, H. Greg Lewis, one of these grandfather or great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather of labor economics, because Lewis was actually a productive researcher who also had lots of students, then had their own students. I think he was maybe the grandfather of Orley Ashenfelter, who's also my grandfather and was. Anyway, so Greg Lewis had this book, looking at already at the time 200 studies looking at the effect of unions on wages, and lots of these studies at the time, were exploring the fact that there was now lots of rich micro data, and essentially lots of these studies. What you do, you run some regression, and roughly speaking, you compare the wages of workers who are unionized, let's say covered by collective bargaining, compared to the others, and using essentially the non-union workers as a counterfactual. But of course, there's lots of problems with interpretation. My next slide is going to be about causal effect, but that's a huge literature focusing on the impact of unions on wages. And then there's a smaller but still important literature looking at how unions reduce wage dispersion. I'm just showing one of the latest one, because despite the fact that I was told in graduate school, as Dwayne said, don't work on unions, nobody's interested into that. David Carter also said, don't work on minimum wages, that's going to kill your career. He just got a Nobel Prize partly for that. And I didn't listen to him. And the DFL paper that Dwayne was talking about talks about unions, but also minimum wages. So yeah, so never listen to your thesis advisor is the I want to hear. Okay, so yeah, that's the latest small installment there. And again, as Dwayne was saying, many studies have shown that deunionization has contributed to the growth in inequality, included the work I did with Nicole and our dear friend, John DiNardo. But, more recently, so that's actually another paper I did with Nicole and Neil Lloyd. It was recently published, actually in a volume of honoring the memory of John DiNardo. That's something else Dwayne was mentioning about doing work. So yeah, I ended up being one of the co-editor of that special issue. But I must admit, yeah, sometimes these things, yeah, took great pleasure getting involved into to that. But anyway, our paper there was trying to show evidence of these threat effects I was mentioning. And now I've come to believe that, okay, just looking at how unions affect inequality by using these standard kind of procedure where you basically say, okay, non-union workers are counterfactual. It's just a treatment that only switches worker from non-union to a union. It may be simplistic because actually in real world, we may be violating this basic assumption because unionization may also be affecting the counterfactual, the wage of non-union workers due to the threat effects. Okay, so since I was talking about causal effects, so this is actually part of the econ literature where we've had a tougher time, thinking of these great natural experiments that could help us get the causal effect of union wages. Actually, John with David Lee had a very clever paper in the US context looking at how close union organizing election could be used for that. So it's kind of the regression discontinuity design idea. Think of a small bargaining group with 19 workers, and then whether the election, you're going to get 9 in favor, 10 against, or 10 in favor, 9 against. It's almost like flipping a coin, and they actually use that to look at the minimum wage effect. And actually, more recently, it's actually a paper that just came out in the QJE by Farber and co-author. In that case, they were looking actually historical data using historical Gallup data. It's actually it's a must-read for anyone interested in the latest stuff on the unions and union wage effect. But there they tried to use an instrumental variable strategy or natural experiment linked to actually the adoption of the Wagner Act and war labor boards in the US. And the rough idea there was that some of the states back in the 30s already had some pretty high unionization rate. And then when we got the federal government to pass the Wagner Act, it mostly boosted up unionization in states that were traditionally had low unionization rate. So that's actually part of the inspiration for our paper, on the right to work laws, is that, okay, yeah, maybe we should try to push that a little more using laws, legal changes as a potential instrument for unionization. Okay, so now just to sum up, I've already mentioned that a couple of times. When you think about big picture, how these the legal context, including, say, the Wagner Act we're talking about, or card signing versus elections or right to work laws, how can it affect wages? And what I call the indirect effect here is just like the standard channel, it will affect the rate of unionization, and then that will have an impact on wages. Okay. Well, what I call the direct effect is that, well, labor laws can also have a more direct impact, say, on the bargaining power of workers, regardless of whether they are unionized or not. And I've already talked about that, the threat effect, back to a famous paper by Sherwin Rosen that was written even before Morley started at the U of T. So we're talking of really, what's the old? Oh, yeah, pretty old stuff, but still very valuable. And what am I saying here? Well, yeah, and this other work that I did with Nicole and Neil, on threat effects. I mean, part of what may be happening, with the unionization rate going down and it's becoming harder and harder to form unions, you may well expect an impact on non-union firms, just because, as is well known, a good way of avoiding unionization is to offer better conditions for your workers. And if the risk of unionization is really low, then you don't need to do that, and wages can be down. Okay, here's my real attempt to use a fancy graph. I don't really tend to use that in my my papers, but and you can see it's pretty kind of basic. I should have gotten one graduate student to do it for me, but it's all of my own. So what I mean by these indirect effects is, okay, the labor laws will affect unionization. That's the effect of labor laws unionization. And then it does, through the union wage effects, will impact the wages. But as I said, thinking about all that, having worked on these issues for a while, I think there may be a problem that this legal environment may also have a direct impact on wages. Okay, and if you thought that these direct effects were not important, then it would be great if we could use these labor laws as essentially instrumental variables that we could then use to get at the causal impact of unions. But if you also have this direct impact, just a legal framework affecting wages regardless of unionization, that would be actually a violation of what many of you know about. With these instrumental variables, you need the variable to be relevant. Laws to be predicting unionization, but you also need the effect to only go through unionization and not kind of directly. And essentially, in this paper, the recent paper on right to work laws with Nicole and Neil, we actually discussed that in more detail in the context of something we're using a lot in economics, a potential outcome framework. That's actually the other part of the recent Nobel Prize, the Angus and Imbens, who actually popularized this way of thinking about the world. And if you know about these things, my direct effect of unionization would be a violation of a complicated acronym called SUDBA. Okay, but if there were no direct effects of labor laws on wages, again, my fancy graphs, then, the effects of labor laws would only go through unionization, and then we could actually conduct, if you want, causal inference using labor laws as natural experiment or instruments for unionization. And let me be very upfront here that, many years ago, I would have just said, oh, I have this great instrumental variable or natural experiment to get at the causal effect of unionization. I think I'm going to show you the causal estimates that you get, when you use this strategy. But as I just told you, I didn't do a great selling job at this point because I told you, yeah, I don't know if it's really a valid natural experiment or internal variable. But regardless, in our study of the right to work, we just thought that because of this change over time in this legislation in some big states in the US, what we can definitely do using popular methods, popular research design like event study analysis, and I'll show you another approach. At the very least, look at how this particular labor law affects actually both unionization and wages. So you can think that's what we call in economics the reduced form impact of the law on wages. So I'm going to try to convince that part is really kosher. We have some good estimates of how right to work laws, affect wages. And I'm also going to show you, if we thought it was only going through unionization, what would be the implied causal estimates. And I'm not going to have a great way of convincing you whether it should be interpreted as a causal estimate or not. But when you get to the results, I'll discuss that in the context of the size of the implied estimates. Okay, so now let me switch to this application I was telling you about. So Dwayne, how am I doing in terms of time? I think I'm okay. Yeah, doing fine. Yeah. Well, just 45 minutes still. No, just kidding. Yeah, probably have 15 minutes or something like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so now let me tell you about this application. So I'm essentially going to present an overview or kind of a summary of this study I recently did. And one great thing about economics these days is that we've been putting over time more and more weight on having great graphs, so for a presentation like this one, I'm actually going to have figures that will hopefully be telling most of the story. I'm going to show you some numbers too, but it's just a way of summarizing the graphs. Okay, I told you already about what right to work laws are about, and I should say we're kind of always a bit jealous here in Canada. In the US they have 50 states, so there's lots of things that you can do, using variation over states that in Canada it tends to be a bit more challenging because we only have 10 province and 3 territories. So that's still one of the main attractions of working with US data. Okay, so the first approach I'm going to show you, in one sense, it's very standard these days in economics. It's essentially going to be an event study design. So what's the idea? Well, simply you have some of these states that suddenly introduce these right to work laws, and we're going to see what happens to wages as a consequence, and also to the rate of unionization. So I showed you the picture earlier on. So Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin first introduced these right to work laws, and West Virginia and Kentucky also a little bit later on. In the paper, I should have circulated the paper, but it's still just a first draft at this point. But we look actually into the political economy of these things, and all these changes actually happened when there was so-called Republican trifecta that essentially means both the governor, the House of Representatives, whatever it's called, the state level, and the Senate also at the state level. So only all flipped Republican. Actually, lots of that actually happened in the 2010 election, and then in the years after these states started implementing that. And I should say that in Wisconsin, already in 2011, there were actually very important changes in the public sector. You know, this 2015 change in Wisconsin, that's for the old workforce. But there was this Governor Scott Walker, who was definitely not a pro-union guy. We introduced this Act 10, and essentially it did introduce right to work in the state of Wisconsin for public sector workers, but also a few other measures. Okay, so actually in the analysis we're going to split public versus private sector because the timing is a bit different. Okay, and I guess everyone who's worked with these this event study design know that there's a assumption there, the so-called parallel trend assumption, which is essentially just saying that, you know, absent this introduction of right to work laws, you know, the trends in wage and unionization in the adopter and non-adopting states would have been the same. And I'm going to actually keep that in mind because I'm going to use a second research design later on, which is going to be quite different based on different assumptions, but I think it's going to be complementing this thing here. And we use microdata from the current population survey that you can then aggregate at the state level. Okay, so that's basically a before and after approach. And I'm going to mostly show you the graphical illustration of that, you know, essentially the difference between these two set of states, the adopting and non-adopting states. Is there something unusual happening at the time the event adoption of right to work laws is happening? So very standard kind of approach, controlling for a bunch of things. And then I'm going to show you some numbers later on that kind of sum that up using a difference in difference design. So that's essentially going to be averaging out the, roughly speaking, the event study, looking at what was the difference before, what was the difference after for a 5 years window on each side. Okay, so well, you remember that's the Thanksgiving picture. But you know, before I show you the event study, just to show you, there's actually a huge difference in the rate of unionization between right to work and non-right to work states. Actually, maybe I should say here that, you know, all the white states with no year, these are actually the states that never adopted right to work. While you see like the dates here in the South, you know, Florida, Georgia, 1947, etc. You know, most of the southern states and many of the Great Plains states, you know, adopted the right to work a long time ago, and you still have that California. It's basically states that tend to vote Democrats still don't have a right to work laws. So New York, California, etc. Okay, just to give you a sense of the comparison. And what we're going to be doing here is essentially comparing these adopting states to the white states, you know, those who've never adopted the right to work. If there's a question about that, I'm happy to go there, but there's lots of recent literature about difference in difference design and event study design. And one of the message there is that you should actually just stick to the control group that's never adopted any of these things, as opposed to comparing yourself to states that have had these laws for a long time. Okay, so back here, so what's the difference? You know, think of the non-right to work states, New York, California, etc. The right to work states, you know, Texas, Florida, etc. So the, not good with colors, but let's call that the orange bar. So that's the non-right to work states compared to the blue bar, the right to work states, the rate of unionization. And you see there's a huge difference, but it's especially high in the public sector. Okay, so if you look at the two groups on the right-hand side here, you know, public administration and education, you see there's a gap of 20 to 30 percentage points in the unionization rate between these right to work and non-right to work. This is just a cross-sectional comparison. There may be other differences between states, which shows you it's actually a big deal. And in the second approach that I'm going to adopt later on, we're actually going to leverage the fact that these right to work laws, I mean, you see when you go to the, okay, fire, it's not the fire department, it's finance, insurance, real estate, business services. There's still a difference there between the two set of states, but you know, the unionization rates are low regardless, okay? So we're going to have a second approach where we're essentially going to use these very low unionization industry as kind of a control for the high unionization industry, because what you see on this picture is that when you have right to work, you can expect a huge impact on, say, education, public administration, but a much smaller impact on the services. And that's going to be useful later on. Okay, I promise you some simple graphs. So this is showing you, you know, when these 5 states are adopting right to work. So I'm contrasting to the states that never adopted right to work. So that's the event study analysis on the unionization rate. And you see, you know, in the pre-period, things go up and down a little bit, but, you know, we tend to worry a lot about pre-trends. I mean, here, if anything, things are actually going up a little bit in the pre-period. And you see that after the adoption of the right to work laws, you know, on the right side, you know, that clearly the unionization rates start going down. So actually, it's pretty good. You know, none of the estimates in the pre-period are significant. You cannot reject that. There's nothing unusual happening in these adopting states while the unionization rate dropped down. And actually, just the eyeball estimate here, you see that it drops by something of the order of magnitude of 2 percentage points. Okay, so it's not a huge impact. And maybe it's because it may take a long time for these right to work laws to have a big effect, you know, through a lower union organizing. And now what happens on wages, and actually here I'm looking at wages for all workers, okay? So that's what I was telling you, it could be either the union or the non-union workers. So kind of the same story here, but you see, you know, from these little bars, you know, the confidence interval, it's not the most precise event study design of history. So you do see visually that there seems to be a drop in wages. So, you know, introducing these laws not only affect unionization, but also impact the wages. So actually, because I'm working in logs, you can think of on this scale as some percentage point impact. So maybe after a couple of years, you know, wages for all workers go down by 1 or 2%. Okay. And actually now back to my graph that I was showing you that, you know, there's some industries where the unionization rate is very low. Anyway, so here I've actually divided in 3 industries that seem to be especially affected by right to work. So that's the public sector. And I should have mentioned that construction is also another industry that's quite affected. And what you see is that essentially the panel on the left, where you have these high unionization industry, that's really where you see all the action, both the unionization rate going down and the wages going down. While in the other industries, actually, there's essentially very little happening, okay? So the picture I showed you earlier on was essentially driven by these big industries. Okay, so now if you try to quantify the numbers, so, oh, my little boxes didn't quite work as well as I was hoping, but so here, what are these numbers? I'm just going to focus when you do the analysis for all the workers. So what you see is that the minus 0.0185, it basically means that wages in the 5 years after compared to the 5 years before, no, sorry, unionization rate dropped by about 2 percentage points, okay? While the wages dropped by about 1.2%, okay? So actually, back to this causal estimation here, I'm showing you that in the simplest possible way. If you thought that the only way right to work affects wages is through the rate of unionization, well, you know, just do a simple division. You know, we reduce the rate of unionization by 1.8, 1.9%. The wages go down by 1.2%. So it means that the union status being union workers will increase your wages by 0.6, which is actually a very large number. What we have here at the bottom, just running standard regression, so just a comparison in the microdata. It's the kind of number that Greg Lewis would have gotten in his book about 30 years ago. So what you see here is that either you think that we're wildly understating what's the true causal impact of unions, it's 0.6 as opposed to 0.16, or what I think actually is going on there is that there's more of a direct impact actually of the labor market institutions on the right to work laws, also on non-union wages, because you make it harder for unions to organize. It also means that it's non-union employer won't have to pay their workers quite as much. Okay, but let me actually just say quickly, because I want to show you in the last 5 minutes another set of results. So as I say, if you believe that we can get the causal impacts here, it's actually pretty large, but it's also fairly imprecise. And I should say that I'm not like totally, I don't think these results in themselves, it's not really the smoking gun I would have hoped for. And one of the reasons is that actually Wisconsin, I was telling you about the public sector in Wisconsin, it's really a big driver of the effects. If I remove Wisconsin public sector, I still find the same kind of results, but it's way more noisy and not significant. And even though we're in the US, we've been playing around with different ways of doing the statistical inference, and with only 5 adopting states, things are actually a little bit noisy there. Okay, so you can think, okay, the direction here, right to work affects both unionization rate and wages. But let's try to think about another way of looking at this issue. So that's the last thing I want to talk about. And that's really motivated by this graph that I was showing you that, any measure like right to work that are going to affect unionization, it's really important to dwell down at the industry level, because as I was showing, in some industries, there's very little unionization, even in states that are more favorable for unions, okay? So as I mentioned before, the rough idea here is to use these industries with a very low unionization rate as controls, if you want, okay? So I was telling you about this identification assumption in the case of the Evans study design. I mean, here essentially we're gonna have a different assumption, which is, just to be clear, let me state what it's gonna be, is it's actually well known that there's large differences in wage across industries. And since I was talking a lot about the public versus private sector, I mean, here in Canada, Morley has been a key contributor on that topic. And what we see is that after adjusting for all kinds of other factors, you tend to get that workers in the public sector are paid more than workers in the private sector. So here, actually, what we're going to be assuming is that, well, whether in Texas or in New York, in the absence of union right to work laws, there's no underlying factor that makes these inter-industry wage differentials larger in one place than the other. So what we're going to say is that if we see that when there's right to work, it really depresses the unionization rate in some industries, and we see that wages also go down in these industries, we're going to interpret that as evidence of impact of the right to work laws. Okay, so you've seen this figure before, and now actually here's a graph that I think tells the whole story. So let me tell you what this graph is about. So now I'm actually contrasting both the wage rates and the unionization rates by industry in the right to work versus non-right to work states. This is actually done in a regression context where I'm also adjusting for a bunch of other factors. But what this line is showing you is that, as I was saying, in education or public administration, in construction is a little bit of the line. What you do see is that states actually that don't have right to work laws tend to have much higher unionization rate. And they also tend to have substantially higher wages, okay? And actually, the R square on this line is about 0.6 or something like that. So it's so when we saw that, we said, oh, that's a pretty interesting story. So you see, there's a whole clump of industries at the bottom, on the left, that tend to have low ionization rate, and there actually that's not where you see the big difference between the right to work and non-right to work state. So, and actually, as it turns out, the slope of this line here is about 0.3 or 0.4. So if you were just to read through it, you would say, okay, when I have these right to work laws, I increase ionization, say, by 20 percentage points, and wages are going to go up by like 8 percentage points. You take the ratio, it gives you something like 40%, okay? And here I've actually a detailed table. I'm gonna run out of time, but here's a big table, but I've extracted a few things from this big table. Actually, maybe I should go to the next one. This is actually showing you the contrast. It's another way of putting this graph together. When I contrast this high ionization industry, which is public administration, education, and construction, to the low ionization industry, what I see is that the difference in ionization rates is about 21%. The difference in wages is 8 or 9%. Okay, that's regression way of just showing you the same thing I was showing on the graph. And now if I go back to here again, this OLS estimate of the effect of union is just running a standard regression, while the so-called IV or causal estimate is basically just based on this graph I was showing you. If I believe that right to work only affects wages through the impact of unionization, then I can use the slope of this line and I get an effect of union, which is 35%. It's still a little bit on the high side, maybe compared to my expectation, but essentially just to maybe sum up here, the results from this second approach, comparing low and high unionization, 20 percentage points on unionization, 8 percentage points on wages. And the assumption I was telling you about, assuming that absent right to work, the inter-industry wage differentials would be the same, may sound a little bit strong, but in both cases, what I do find is that I kind of get a bigger impact than what I would have found just saying, oh, right to work affects unionization and the union wage effect is like 15% or something like that. We're definitely missing something. And actually what I really wanted to tell you here, first slide of the conclusion, is that, let me get right away to the third bullet point, to the magnitude of these effects. And essentially, there's different ways you can think about it. It's either that we've understated this effect of unions on wages if we think that all the impact is going through this indirect channel, right to work affects unionization, then affects wages, or actually, more importantly, even if you're not sure about that, I think the result which is showing you is that actually these labor laws, this particular one, the right to work, does have actually a very big impact on wages, whether it's only through this indirect effect, the causal mechanisms, or actually both an indirect and direct effect. Because, as I was saying, if you think if you're in a high unionization industry in California, you're going to be earning, even adjusting for average differences in wages between California and Texas, you're going to be actually earning 8% more working in that industry, which is actually a pretty big number. Okay, so that's kind of the main results. And actually going back to the sort of big picture, I was telling you about the the role of institutions and unionization and growth of inequality, the labor share, etc. I mean, that part is a little more speculative. It's not being driven by the results per se, but as many of you likely know, and that was one of an early motivation long time ago when I started working on the unions and inequality is that the economics literature tends to focus on supply and demand being often linked to technological change. And actually, many of these recent studies trying to understand why the labor share has been going down have been trying to stress the role of technology. And I think, these new results are, showing some additional evidence that it's probably not the full story. Both unionization is an important factor, but also more broadly, the whole legal and policy environment in the labor market that has important implication for unionization, also have some pretty important implication for wages. And another totally speculative thing here is that one of the great things that's been happening in labor economics over the last 5-10 years is that thanks to much better data, we're able to think much more seriously and informally about the role of imperfect competition. And I think lots of the results are showing that the simple neoclassical model learned in graduate school, where you have perfect competition, is really missing a lot of important parts. And recent studies show that, with imperfect competition, labor market concentration, this can have a big impact on wages. And actually, in that context, the legal environment is not only unionization, but many other labor laws that could affect outsourcing, non-compete clause. The list is actually very long. In imperfectly competitive labor markets, these kind of factors can have a big impact also on the wages. So that was kind of my attempt of telling you that these seemingly narrow effects of right to work on wage and unionization, I think big picture, it reminds us that institution policy and laws are also a big story about what's been happening to wages in recent years, over the last 5 years or 5 decades, depending on how you think about it. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions. And I should probably stop sharing slides so that people remotely can see the room. Yeah, I think that's going to be there. All right.
So what we'll do is, is this working, Devin? Excellent. I will first address some of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A. So if you're online, you can submit questions to the Q&A, and I will exercise my moderator power to pick maybe some of the bigger picture questions. So I'll begin, and I'll name you if you question it. So Diego Restucia is asking for more of a macro question, but it's really going back to the labor share and asking about your views on the role of unions in technological adoption, AI and other labor-saving technologies. Could unions or labor laws perhaps accelerate the substitution towards these other technologies, generating a deeper fall in the labor share? So it's really looking at the interaction between unions and the technology and the adoption and the labor share.
Yeah, I mean, I should actually say that one of the motivation for looking at labor laws or the effect unionization is that you may think, I mean, the concern is that lots of this deunionization is actually just an endogenous response to other factors, including technological change that, I mean, there was some earlier work many years ago, I think, yet another Acemoglu, Aguillon, and Violante, I think, actually, pointing out that if you have technological change that's actually increasing wage differentials, it may actually make it harder for unions to operate because you try to redistribute, but there's a limit to how much of the redistribution could be happening. So it's true that it's actually a tricky issue that it may be that these technological change, are actually affecting unionization, but likewise, the labor laws and unionization can also affect in one way the technological adoption, because if labor is remaining more expensive, you may try to bring in more automation. For instance, I mean, I should say that as much as I was trying to claim that unionization and institutions could play a big role in the labor share, I mean, at this point, I think the evidence has been that if you stick in unionization, it doesn't seem to have a huge impact, on the labor share. But, I was wondering, taking the long view, if you try to codify a little bit better these the legal environment, etc. Because that's actually one of the examples. The right to work laws in highly industrialized states. That further weaken the union power. So I must say that I get the sense that unions are still important, and that the bargaining power of workers must still have an important effect there. But I totally agree that the interaction between technological change and unionization is challenging, and up to this point, it's been a bit hard to identify a direct impact on unionization of the labor share. Yeah.
Thanks, Thomas. So a question from Marianne Gonzalez. What made you choose, this is, asking for another instrument. So what made you choose unionization laws as an IV, since one of the main roles of unions is to negotiate wages on behalf of employees? So why was this the instrument?
The right to work kind of law? Yeah. Well, I think as is often the case in, okay, I'll tell you the old history. You may find that interesting. So I had this first work with Neil and Nicole where we were trying to look at the threat effects. And there's been actually a challenge in that literature that, because it's kind of what we call the ecological regression problem, it's kind of saying that, okay, it's not only my union status that matters, but also the unionization rate in my industry or my state may also actually matter. And that would be a way, these threat effects are important, because if I'm in a place that there's a high unionization rate, there's probably a high threat effect. And even if I'm a non-union person, I may actually get a higher wage. And then we start thinking about how could we find a natural experiment IV that could help untangle these things. And then that's when we got into the right to work, just because there was this really nice experiment, if you want, going on in the States, in the Midwestern states. So that was actually the original motivation for looking at that. And then now we have this follow-up paper where we're trying to focus more on that. So, I mean, I would say that that's kind of one of the first motivation. It's kind of important labor laws that are changing and can help get at these effects. And then actually the previous literature had shown that right to work definitely does have an impact on unionization. And at first we thought, well, maybe it's not so obvious that it would affect the non-union wages too. So that was, but I would say a big part of the motivation was that it's a big institutional change in states that were traditionally more unionized. So that was a big part of the motivation for looking at that. And in one sense, when we saw that other researchers were using the Wagner Act and other things, we said, okay, we're probably in a better situation because our laws are actually changing in recent years where we have lots of data. So I would say there's an array of different labor laws we could use for that, but the fact that we had one had been recently changing provided variation we felt could be
Thanks, Thomas.
Useful.
So Mitch Hoffman is asking and noting that in right to work states, do a lot of people free ride within unions? So there's another variable kind of going on there. Is it more of existing unions dying out or lack of new unions being formed? So what are the mechanisms of the unionization?
Yeah, I think lots of it is the lack of new unions being formed. And actually an old paper by Elwood and Fine that I mentioned was actually using data on union elections that were actually available back from the late 40s. So they were actually able, using union elections, they were able to see what was the impact of, say, Texas including adopting right to work back then, and it did find a substantial impact. So, but of course, that may also explain why when I was doing the Evans study, you see the impact were not kind of huge. While in the second strategy, they were actually much bigger. And I think part of what may be happening is what Mitch is mentioning. Well, let's see if it's mostly the new unions, that's going to take actually a long time to make its way. So the Evans study design may not be capturing that, while the second approach was essentially capturing the long-term differences, where the fact that for decades unions had a hard time adopting, unions had a hard time organizing in right-to-work states. We make it important. And I should say that, to be totally honest, in that case, it may not be only right-to-work laws, because these legislation tends to come together. So, for instance, in Wisconsin in 2011, when this Act 10 was adopted, what they also did was to say, oh, and by the way, not only we have right to work, but if you want to stay a union, you have to recertify every year. You need a vote so that workers stay into unions. And actually, in that particular case in Wisconsin, what did happen is that a bunch of unions got decertified as a result of that. But that was not actually purely the right to work. So my reading of the evidence is that it's more like the failure of organizing new unions.
So Rafael Gomez has a question. A study by Freeman et al., I'm just going to read it because it's easier to think, called Twin Track Model of Unionization showed that all those recent states adopted right to work laws when the state union density fell below the national. So had reached a threshold. Union power weakened before the right to work law. Does that affect, in other words, it's really a question about your trends?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. We were actually worried both about that and also about the fact that the timing was shortly after the Great Recession, and some of these states were actually adversely impacted. And actually, just to see the full story, part of the reason when these Republican governors came in and put the right to work, it was really part of a broader plan to cut costs, in the public sector, reduce wages, etc. So we were actually quite worried about that. We tried different kind of controls for CD unemployment rate, etc. But at the end of the day, when you look at these pre-trends, and especially I didn't have time to mention that it was in a slide, but we also do another Evans study where we only compare these states to the so-called Rust Belt states that didn't adopt right to work. So that would be Ohio, Illinois, Minnesota. Actually, we did New York without New York City. And because actually the same kind of phenomena was happening in these places. And again, you see that the pre-trend seems to be good. So that's something we're quite concerned about. But I think at the end of the day, we think it's really the right to work as opposed to just a trend that was happening before. Yeah.
Take two questions from the studio audience.
Yeah.
I know, Phil, you had your hand up earlier. Is it?
Yeah.
Chomping at the
Do you
bit?
need to bring the mic or repeat the? Yeah.
No, I will bring the mic over. I'm mobile.
Yeah. But Dwayne says it's okay, so it's yeah.
Yes, so just two quick points. One is it possible that the point estimates being a bit higher in this is maybe due to the fact that the industries that seem to be affected have less competition, like the public sector and the education? And maybe a related question is, now that you have possibly a credible instrument for a union, why not put like lots of other things on the left-hand side? You can look at productivity, employment. I'm sure you have 5 different papers that you could do, one for each.
I'll first do inequality. This was just the wage level, but yeah, no, that's a great question, because of course, as we know from our Gunderson and Imbens friends, when you do this thing, you get local average treatment effect. And there's no question that I should have mentioned that you're absolutely right. What we're getting is a measure of the union wage premium and these high unionization industry like the public sector. Actually, yeah, it's actually a challenging one because I did show you at one point this reference to a recent paper I did with Craig Riddell and David Card, where we're looking at both wage levels and inequality, but contrasting the public and private sector. And what's actually challenging when you say, okay, let's use as a benchmark some more or less estimates in these different sectors. The counterfactual in the public sector, public administration, who are the non-union public sector administration work is kind of weird. And actually, in some cases, we're getting highly counterintuitive results. And it was probably because many of the non-union workers were managers, for instance. So, yeah, I think actually it does make sense. These are high rents industry in one sense, deep pocket argument. Yeah, so I wish I had a better sense of, because the other good stuff that you can do in the private sector is to use a different strategy. Now that you have all this great employer-employee data, you can measure some shock to value added, something like that, and then in principle you could see based on unionization, what's the share of the rent you're capturing, and you could use that to see across these different industries in the private sector, whether the union effect is bigger. So my hunch is that the true causal effect is probably higher in the public sector and education, as you say, compared to the private sector industries, but it's hard to benchmark to your non-causal kind of all that's because of the weird less in education in the US, but no, that's a good point, because the 35% is not crazy in some high rent industries, I think, as a union wage effect. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Did you have a question, Michael?
Thanks, Wayne. So just, you've sort of alluded to it in some of your comments, but my concern, of course, right to work is a particularity of the Taft-Hartley legislation. It applies only to private sector workers because, of course, public sector workers are governed exclusively by state jurisdiction. And the difficulty for me, just in looking at trying to sort out the signals, is it's pure. The right to work is much purer as a signal because you've got a single legislative change that applies in a common way. The problem in the public sector, of course, is all from the budget repair bill in Wisconsin to Senate Bill 5 in Ohio to any number of the changes in various public sector legislation across the United States following 2010.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how to sort those out because institutionally they're all particular. And most of them involve sort of reversion of right to work, but some of them also involve significant changes to arbitration, to a number of different provisions governing public sector activity. And so I'm just wondering about how to sort out that signal, because it's very different in education and the public service versus the private sector workforce.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a great question. So maybe to mention that again, actually, in the but maybe a supporting piece of. Okay, no, let me talk again in the case of Wisconsin, because as I mentioned, and just stress that again, at first it was all about changing things in the public sector only. And so as I said, there was this recertification that was also happening, and a whole slew of other measures that were happening. And I would say that kind of my conservative, well, I don't know if it's conservative, but kind of a simple answer is that it's kind of right to work and also a package of other measures that tend to often come along with right to work. And I should say that's something I should have digged in much more into, because when I was working on this paper and I realized the importance of the public sector, I started looking back at some of the work Richard Freeman, there was a mention of Richard Freeman and others back in the 80s. There was a big research effort on they had a book at one point, Unionization Comes to the Public Sector. And then they had actually a very useful description of all these different, all the difference in the legal environment, across the different states. How did it shape, unionization in the public sector, etc. So what I would say is that we could well be capturing just the impact of some other measures, but I thought that the next step would be, okay, let's try to update this work that had been done by Freeman and others, so that we can really be sure that we're talking about the right to work after controlling for all these other factors that may be influencing things. I mean, actually, construction I thought was interesting, because that's more private sector. And actually, sometimes you think about it, it's a bit of a miracle that in some places the unionization rate is high in construction, because lots of the things you have around you tends to be the definition of an employer is not always clear. You have lots of transient workers, etc. So we kind of thought it was interesting that unless you have a really legal environment that really promotes unionization, that would be one of the first place where unions may be gone. And actually, that was actually the impact of right to work was even bigger, in the construction sector than the public sector. So maybe actually we should actually try to just rerun things. What was nice about the second approach, where I show you this line, is that also the public sector kind of drives it, education, public administration. Even for the other industries, the private sector, the same line seems to be there. But that's a great question. I should have a better answer, but it's on the list of things we'd like to do later on.
Thanks very much, Tomas. I'm going to turn it to Frank for some closing remarks.
Yep.
So I just wanted to thank Tomas for the excellent lecture. I mean, I think it was really effective bringing together of the labor relations side and labor laws with the kind of labor economics and the kind of quantitative analysis. And I think that enriches both fields enormously. So I just like to thank you for an excellent lecture. And then to wrap up, I just want to thank everyone who attended, both the people who are here in person and also the people who are online. So I think it was a great evening, and so we can sign off then and just say good night.